ritual human sacrifices, as we mentioned, young women buried in these mass graves. Some were likely strangled, others possibly died of bloodletting. Four men were found with their heads and hands cut off. Another burial pit had mostly males that had been clubbed to death in very violent ways. A lot of people in Cahokia themselves may have doled out some of this violence, since researchers have found no specific evidence of warfare or invasion from outsiders. Emerson says he has excavated, this is the the archaeologist, if you can remember, he has excavated other Native American sites that were filled with arrowheads left behind by war. By comparison, at Cahokia, there was almost none. It's interesting, he adds, at Cahokia, danger was from the people on top, not other people or tribes or locations attacking you. William Esminger, the archaeologist and assistant manager to Cahokia Mounds, points out that there must have been at least some continuing threat to the city, whether from distant or local sources, that necessitated it being built and rebuilt 4 times between 1175 and 1275. Perhaps they were never attacked, but the threat was there, and leaders felt the need to expend a tremendous amount of time, labor, and material to protect the central ceremonial product. The story of Cahokia's decline and eventual end is a mystery. After reaching its population height in about 1,100, the population shrinks and vanishes by 1350. Perhaps they had maybe exhausted the land's resources, as some scholars theorize, or they were victims of political and social unrest, climate change, or extended droughts. Whatever, Mississippians simply walked away, and Cahokia was gradually abandoned. Tales of Cahokia don't even show up in Native American folklore or oral histories, Emerson said. Apparently, what happened in Cahokia left a bad taste in people's minds. The earth and the mounds and what they left behind are the only narratives provided. It's global. Thank you so much for listening to today's show on the Spencer Walsh Radio Network. Stay with us on our broadcast for an explanation of why the Titanic sunk. Question that's often asked, but rarely truly answered.
All right, that looks good. Ship's veering to port, go 22 knots. Sideswipes the iceberg. Murdoch ports around the iceberg, try to keep from hitting the propellers. That looks pretty good. Okay, so now we're watching in accelerated time. We see the first 5 compartments flood. They equalize pretty quickly. Bows pulled down. We see the port list. Port list looks right. That looks like about 9 degrees. Well, you can really see the effect of that list on the flooding.
This is James Cameron
superstructure starts to get pulled under,
explaining how the Titanic sunk on a step-by-step basis.
Funnels collapse at their base. Now the bow is accelerating downward. That looks good. We're starting to see the stern come up. We got our maximum peak stress, and yeah, boom, it breaks. Okay, bow swinging down. That looks good. The double keel hang on, and then they separate. Bow plunges straight down. All right, we got mast snapping back. The funnels are ripping backwards, pulling off all the davits. Bow's going down like a torpedo. Here's the angle when it falls through into a stable position. Let's see the stern. Heeling way over to port. That looks right. And she goes, yep, that's right. She goes almost vertical just when she goes under, and then boom, implodes. Now she accelerates, and all the stuff starts to rip off. See the shell plating going. There goes the double bottom frisbeeing off. And the stern's falling through.
One of the ships that was meant to be one of the most unsinkable things in the world ended up in the bottom of the ocean. There is James Cameron explaining to National Geographic for their Titanic 100 series as he walks him and his team walked National Geographic through a new CGI of how they believe the Titanic sank and reached the ocean floor, according to their description. And one of the questions that we should answer today is, why did this end up at the bottom of the floor? As an estimated 10,000 people gathered on the dock of the Belfast in March 31st, 1911, to watch the launch of the RMS Titanic, considered to be an unsinkable ship. Titanic was the largest and most luxurious cruise liner of its day, measuring more than 882 feet from prow to stern, the length of 4 city blocks, and 175 feet high, weighing more than 46,000 tons. It boasted state-of-the-art technology. Every technological breakthrough in the past half-century had been put on this ship. It was incredible. Yet on the night of its maiden voyage, just 4 days after leaving April 14th, 1912, just 4 days after leaving Southampton, England, on its maiden voyage to New York, the Titanic struck an iceberg on the coast of Newfoundland and sank. Now, more than a century after Titanic went down, experts are still debating possible causes of the historic disaster that took more than 1,500 passengers and crew. Most of them agree that only a combination of circumstances can fully explain what doomed this supposedly unsinkable ship. This ship was hypothetically, theoretically, just supposed to be unstoppable, incredible.
A prestigious journal, the Shipbuilder magazine, called the Titanic practically unsinkable. The popular opinion quickly grew that the Titanic was indestructible. An ominous consequence of this overconfidence, during its voyage, there were no passenger safety drills to give instructions on where to go or which lifeboats to board in case of emergency. But there weren't enough lifeboats to begin with, only 20 available, which was enough to carry about half of the total passengers and crew. Bruce Ismay, the owner, thought having 64 lifeboats, enough for everyone on board, would make the ship look too cluttered. This emphasis on elegance didn't stop with Titanic's outward appearance. Inside were top-notch luxuries, the grand staircase running the height of 6 decks, a heated swimming pool, a state-of-the-art gym, 4 restaurants, and 2 barbershops. So how much did the Titanic cost? About $7.5 million at the time, or over $400 million today. Now, over 100 years later, the Titanic has been hidden in darkness, lying over 12,000 feet deep in the Atlantic Ocean.
So, the question is, how did it get there? And what mistakes were made at the time? We'll give you a few of the causes to help maybe put your mind at ease. So, it was traveling too fast. That's really one of the most common and sensible explanations that many people just sometimes don't consider. Because from the beginning, some blamed the Titanic skipper, Captain Smith, E.J. Smith, for sailing the massive ship at such a high speed through the iceberg-heavy waters of the North Atlantic. Some believe Smith was trying to better the crossing of the Titanic's White Star sister ship, the Olympic. But in a 2004 paper, engineer Robert Eisenberg speculated the efforts to control a fire in one of the ship's coal bunkers could have been the reason why the Titanic was sailing at full speed. Here's another big thing. The wireless radio operator dismissed a key iceberg warning. Less than an hour before the Titanic hit the iceberg, another ship, California, radioed to say that it had been stopped by a dense ice field. But as the ship didn't begin with the prefix MSG, or Master Surface Gram, which would have required the captain to directly acknowledge the receiving message, the Titanic's radio operator, Jack Phillips, didn't consider the ship's warning non-urgent and didn't pass it along as something he wanted to just give to the captain maybe a little bit later. It may have taken a fatal wrong turn, according to a claim made in 2010 by Louise Patton, the granddaughter of the most senior Titanic officer to survive, Charles Lightoller, said one of the ship's crew members panicked after hearing the order to turn hard to starboard in order to approach to avoid an approaching iceberg. Because ships at the time operated on 2 different steering order systems, he became confused and turned the wrong way, directly towards the ice. Patton included this version of events, which she said she had heard from her grandmother after Lighttoller's death in her fictionalized account of the Titanic disaster, Good as Gold. Here's another possibility. The Titanic's builders tried to possibly cut cost, even though it did cost $7.5 million to make. Maybe some of the costs were cut along the way. In 1985, a American-French expedition finally located the historic wreck. Investigators discovered that, contrary to earlier findings, the Titanic had not sunk intact after hitting the iceberg, but had broken apart, as James Cameron so wonderfully put to us, in 2 different halves. Just below the ocean's surface was where it snapped. Material scientists Tim Fouquet and Jennifer Hooper McCarthy had cast blamed on more than 3 million rivets in the whole stills placed together. When they examined the rivets brought up from the wreck and found them to contain a high concentration of slag, a smelting residue that can make metal split apart, this may have been something that weakened the part of the Titanic's hull that hit the iceberg, causing it to break apart upon impact. Also, this may sound like an excuse, but really, you got to blame it on the weather. 2 studies done around the time of the 100th anniversary of the Titanic disaster in 2012 argued that the nature played a key role in the ship's fate. The first argued that the Earth came unusually close to both the Moon and the Sun that year, increasing their gravitational pull on the ocean and producing record tides that caused increased amounts of floating ice in the North Atlantic around the time of the sinking. The second study, by British historian Tim Moulton, claimed the atmospheric conditions on the night of the disaster might have caused the phenomenon called a super refraction. The bending light could have created mirages or optical illusion that prevented the Titanic's lookouts from seeing the iceberg clearly. It also would have made the Titanic appear closer and smaller to the nearby ship, California, causing its crew to assume there was a different ship without a radio, preventing them from attempting to communicate. From their vantage point, with these hazy conditions, when the Titanic started to sink, the California's crew might have thought it was merely sailing away, even though there was there were some distress calls. They were largely ignored at that time. So here's another problem. The lookouts had no binoculars, and it feels like every time I read one of these things, I just want to go, oh, damn it, why didn't we think of that? Second Officer David Blair, who held the key to the Titanic's store of binoculars in his pocket, was transferred off the ship before it left for its maiden voyage from Southampton and forgot to hand over the key to the officer who replaced him. At a later inquiry into the sinking, a lookout on the Titanic said binoculars might have helped them spot and dodge the iceberg in time. Blair kept the key as a memento of his near miss, was auctioned off in 2007 and fetched some 90,000 euros. Wow. Whew. Yeah, that's pretty funny for something that actually happened. Yeah, no matter. Here's probably the most obvious one of these possibilities. There was not enough lifeboats. No matter what caused the Titanic to sink, such a massive loss of life could have probably been avoided if the ship had carried if the ship had carried a sufficient amount of lifeboats for all the passengers and crew. But the White Star liner left Southampton with 20 lifeboats, the legal minimum, and a total capacity of 1,178 people. A little hard to bear at that point, though Maurice Clark, the civil servant who inspected the Titanic at Southampton, recommended it carry 50% more lifeboats. His handwritten notes at the later time revealed he felt his job would be threatened if he did not give the famous ship the go-ahead to sail. Due to the chaos that ensued after the Titanic struck the iceberg, the 20 lifeboats departed the ship with more than some 400 empty seats, leaving more than 1,500 people to perish in the frigid ocean waters. So, could have saved more even with the small amount of lifeboats that they had. So, that is a little bit of a more worrying situation. And as we round out the 30-minute mark, that's it for today's show. We hope you really like the show.